This week in the Regency, we're going to leave the Regency. I'm starting a new series on Regency royals, which will happen on the fourth week of each month. And I realized that in order to understand the Regency royals, you have to understand how they got to be royal. Because by no means can they be considered the rightful heirs of the British throne, leaving religion aside. So I thought it was useful, just since we've got 5 weeks in March, I'm going to take this extra week to give you some background on the Hanoverians, the Georgians. And we're starting with a newspaper article from 1714. So 100 years earlier than we normally talk about. And this is from our friends at Stamford Post. The Lord Justices, having appointed the 19th of October for the coronation, this day the King's carpenters began to build the necessary scaffolds in Westminster Abbey and in the hall, and the shopkeepers are ordered to quit their shops till after the ceremony is performed, which I think was a bit hard on them, because there would be thousands of people there. Think of the trade they had to give up. Some of the Lord Justices here seem to dissent from an order for turning out 2 of the Lord Justices of Ireland, saying it was better to let it home till His Majesty's arrival. So His Majesty is arriving. Where is he arriving from? Yesterday, the Lord Treasurer, Chancellor, etc., took the oaths in the Exchequer before the Barons Price and Bury. This afternoon came in 2 Dutch posts advising that the King was come to The Hague and that the English and Dutch fleets were joined and waited for a wind to take the King on board, and that the States Deputies met His Majesty at Wearden. So who was His Majesty? His Majesty was the man who became King George I. And the reason he was coming from via Holland, via the Netherlands, is because he was German, and that was his closest port. And also because France and England didn't like each other very much, but Holland and the Netherlands and England were allies. So he goes via there, gets the royal treatment, and comes to England as George I. The question is, why is England having a German king? And that goes back to this guy, James II. James II is the son of Charles I, and he's the one who got his head cut off. And that's important to remember, I feel. Son of Charles I and brother of Charles II, the one who came back in the restoration of the monarchy. And James, the big difference between James and everybody else in the English royal family at that time was that, influenced, so they said, by his wife, James had become Catholic. So at this point, when he first became a Catholic, he had no sons. He had Mary and Anne were his daughters. And he started acting like an idiot, like a religious bigot, basically, full of religious fervour. Now, it has to be said that at this point, Catholics in Britain were treated very badly. Not so much in Scotland, but in England, very much so. There were all sorts of jobs they weren't allowed to have. They couldn't be members of parliament. They couldn't take certain jobs in the army or navy. They couldn't work in the bureaucracy. They were excluded from a large part of the power of the nation. He didn't think that was right. And he started giving jobs by decree to people who legally weren't allowed to have them. And so he was arguably going against the law. More importantly, he was going against Parliament, which was resoundingly Protestant. No surprise, because Catholics couldn't be members of Parliament, right? So they were very Protestant indeed. And what they saw was James II starting to act like his dad, Charles I, ignoring Parliament, being not at all happy either. Neither party was happy. And so they started looking around for who could they get to be king instead. They didn't want a gap like there had been before. They didn't want a civil war. It's in living memory, this civil war. And so they really didn't want another civil war at this point. And so they started looking around, and they decided that his eldest daughter, Mary, would be a better monarch. And the reason they decided that was because he had a boy. Another James, and he was going to be raised Catholic. And so the heir to the throne was Catholic, and they just weren't having that. So they decided that Mary, who was the eldest of the non-Catholic children, would be the next monarch. And 7 men decided to invite not just Mary, but also Mary's husband, William of Orange. So here they are. William III, as he became, Queen Mary, Mary II. They had been married for a while, and he was, quite importantly, I think, a very highly regarded military strategist and had won lots of battles. They were cousins. He was a steward as well through his mother's line, and they used that to justify the fact that he should be king. So he wasn't just being invited as a consort to Mary, where she would be queen and he would be the prince consort, like Elizabeth and Philip. But no, he would be king too, because these were Protestants who had been influenced very strongly by the Puritans, and they didn't think that a woman should be in charge of a man, that she should have any authority over him. And so they invited William and Mary as a package, that he would be king, she would be queen. And William said, all right, I'll come if I can be king. And he arrived. There was what's called the Glorious Revolution, and they imprisoned James. Now, this is the point where you have to remember that James's dad got his head cut off because he tried to escape, and William, not being an idiot, let him. James headed off for France. France was delighted to cause trouble for England, and so made him welcome. And William and Mary took the throne. You would think everything would settle down, but no, because they didn't have any children. Mary had a miscarriage, and it's believed that led to issues where she couldn't have more children. And so they started looking around again for, well, who's going to be next? And in 1689, the Parliament passed what's now known as the Bill of Rights, the Act of the Bill of Rights. There were 2 main reasons for doing that. One was we're not going to have any king come in again and cause all sorts of problems by putting decrees here and decrees there and so on. And so the Bill of Rights is actually about constraining the power of the monarchy. And Britain was the first country to really do it in this way, to say, nope, you can't override Parliament. You can't tax anybody without our permission. You can't do ABC. There's a whole list of things that the monarch's not allowed to do. And obviously, I think they did that because William was a foreigner. And also, they were just fed up with these stewards who come in and try to, take over. So, so they had the Bill of Rights, and part of the Bill of Rights was the succession. And they decided that the succession was going to go Mary, Anne's children, and if she didn't have any children, any children William had from a second marriage. So far, so good. So then we come to Anne, Queen Anne. Now, just to remind you, James II is her dad. So it was her grandfather who had his head cut off, and he ran away to France. And incidentally, when he ran away, Parliament decided that that was the excuse they needed. You've clearly abdicated, they said. Absolutely, in this 1869 bill, you've clearly abdicated, therefore the throne is vacant and we can give it to William and Mary, which is a nice little bit of sophistry, I think. So Anne, House of Stuart, married her husband named George. A lot of Georges around in those days. Very, very close and loving couple. And this is where we find that, in fact, as with Mary, the rise of the Hanoverians, of the Georgians, comes from an enormous tragedy. Anne had 17 pregnancies. Of those, a lot of were miscarried. Some were stillborn. 5 of them were live births. So she had 12 either miscarried or stillborn. 5 of them were live births. And of those children, 2 died in infancy. 2 died as toddlers, like under 5, of the smallpox. There was 1 left, and that was Prince George. I just can't imagine what that was like. She tried to do her best by her country. She tried to produce heirs to stop civil war effectively. 17 times, and you've got to think that it was only that sense of duty forcing her on to have her last pregnancies. People have done armchair diagnoses about her. The current thinking seems to be that she may have had lupus. What is nice, though, is that it clearly brought her and her husband very close together. There are lots of contemporary accounts about how grief-stricken they were, the death of their children, together, spending time together. So she had no children because in 1700, her one sole remaining baby, who was 11 years old, Prince George, died. We think possibly smallpox. We don't really know. And at this point, people are getting very worried. As you can imagine, in Britain, it's 1700. William and Mary are still on the throne. William is still on the throne. Mary died in 1694 without having any more children. William shows no signs of wanting to get married again. It was apparently quite a good marriage. Anne is producing stillborn after stillborn child, and then Prince George dies. And there is literally no one left in England. And at that point, they go, okay, because the problem is that we still have James II. So the actual, supposed, according to the Jacobites, rightful King of England still there. And he has a son who would have been James III. His name's also James. He's Catholic, living in France. He's Anne's brother. In most places, he would absolutely be the legal heir, but because of the Bill of Rights, he can't be, because that stops Catholics from taking the throne. But he's there, waiting in the rings, waiting for a civil war to start the minute that Anne dies. And so Parliament goes, we've got to get us a Protestant heir. And they look up and down the Stuart family tree. They look a long way away, and they come up with a man called George, who was the Elector of Hanover. Now, he was the son of Sophia, who was a granddaughter of James I, Sophia of Hanover. And she was originally said to be Anne's heir because she was the closest Protestant to Anne in the Stuart family tree. But she was old. And by the time that Anne died in 1714, Sophia had died a few months before that. She was 83. However, her son was there. And in the Act of Settlement in 1701, he had been declared as the next heir after Sophia. And so he's the king who's waiting for the wind to change in the Netherlands. He's the king that the British and Dutch fleets escort to England. And he becomes George I, the House of Hanover. Hanover is a small area of Germany. Germany was not a country then. It was not unified. It was part of the Holy Roman Empire. And George owned quite a bit of Germany at this point, with various archduchies and Hanover. And he was called the Elector of Hanover. Doesn't mean he was elected. He wasn't. And for quite a long time, indeed, up until Victoria's time, the British monarch also owned or had rights to Hanover. But it couldn't pass down through the female line, ironically, and so once Victoria took the throne, it went to somebody else. Just to clarify, George I, the first of the Hanoverians, the first of the Georgians, was Queen Anne's second cousin. They had a shared great-grandfather who was James VI of Scotland and James I of England. In between them were 56 people who had a better right to the throne than George did, but they were all Catholic. So he was the closest Protestant. It's all about religion at this point. The Parliament decided that they would only have a Protestant. And interestingly, some of the people they approached said, look, just convert to Protestantism, and quite a few people went no. So the big thing is that they were indeed both of the same kind of faith, although Anne was Anglican and he was Lutheran. He converted to the Church of England because he became the head of the Church of England on his coronation. And he became the king in 1714. A lot of people still wanted the Jameses, James III, James II, and the guy who eventually became Bonnie Prince Charlie. And there were various attempts to revolt against the Georgians, and they all failed, some of them absolutely miserably. And so we get the Georgians technically between 1714 and 1830, which is when George IV dies. This is George I, George II, George III, George IV. George IV is Prinny. The person who takes over is the Prince Regent. He dies in 1830 and his brother William IV takes over. And that's technically the end of the Georgians, but most people really think of it as going up until the Victorian period, which starts when Victoria takes the throne in 1837. So, to recap, the reason we have the Georgians is that nobody liked the Catholics. The reason we have the Georgians is because James II was an idiot and a religious bigot, and also full of religious fervour. And a kind of misplaced sense of, well, it wasn't a misplaced sense of justice, but it was a misplaced sense of what he could get away with as king. He believed his grandfather was the one who wrote about the divine rights of king. He believed him. He'd been brought up with that, and that caused most of the problems with the Stuarts, indeed, that idea that they had the right to do whatever they wanted. And Parliament went, no, you don't. We would like a Protestant king, thank you, who won't go around with these stupid decrees. And indeed, it took until 1829, so almost the end of the Georgian era, before Catholics got any rights. So in 1829, the Catholic Relief Bill, Catholic Emancipation Bill was published, and that allowed people to start, standing for Parliament and those kinds of things. So I just thought it would be useful to you to have that background. It's a very muddy, mixed up period, particularly kind of the second half of the 1600s. But if we understand that the Georgians come in as foreigners, they were never really beloved. Everybody wanted them rather than a civil war, but they weren't beloved people really until George III comes along, because he was the first one who was actually born in England. George I, George II, both born in Germany. George III was the first real Englishman, so to speak, in the language of the time. And he had a different relationship with his people. And he's the one we're going to be talking about next week. So this was this century leading up to the Regency. I'm Elizabeth Leyden. I'll see you next week in the Regency.